The dawn cast a golden hue over the Texas plains as Jim and Emily Roberts walked side by side through their farm. The day promised to be hot, but the worry on Jim's face already signaled the storm brewing in their lives. Emily, usually vibrant and full of life, now moved slowly with one hand pressed against her chest and heavy breathing. "Jim, I need to rest for a bit," Emily said, her tone trying to mask the distress. Jim guided her to a nearby fallen trunk and watched as she tried to catch her breath. "This is happening too often, Em. We're going to the doctor. No more excuses." She tried to protest, but the pain in her eyes revealed the seriousness of the situation. Reluctantly, she agreed, knowing that the unknown could be scarier than the illness growing inside her. At Dr. Stevens's clinic, the doctor shared the test results with a gravity that made Jim's heart sink. "Emily, you have a rare disease," the doctor explained carefully. "There are treatments available, but they're expensive and not available here in our town." Jim squeezed Emily's hand. "What does this mean? How much does it cost? And where do we need to go?" he asked, his voice laden with determination and fear. "The treatments are complex and may require constant trips to specialized centers in another city, maybe even another state," Dr. Stevens continued, handing them a list of possible treatments and specialists. In the silence of the journey back home, neither of them spoke. Jim was lost in thoughts of how he would afford the treatment costs, while Emily clung to the hope that remained. "We'll find a way, Em," Jim finally broke the silence with a voice attempting to convey more confidence than he truly felt. "I'll do whatever it takes. We'll get the money for your treatment." Emily smiled weakly, seeking comfort in Jim's promise. "I know, Jim. I trust you." Her voice was low but firm, bolstered by the strength of the love they shared. As Emily's health deteriorated, Jim fought against time. In an unexpected encounter at the local cafe, while discussing possible loans with the bank manager, Jim was approached by Susan, a doctor who had heard about Emily's situation through the small community. "Mr. Roberts, my name is Susan Harris. I specialize in experimental treatments, and I believe I can help your wife," she said, extending a confident hand. Jim, initially skeptical, felt a spark of hope upon hearing her words. Susan explained about a new available treatment that had shown promising results in cases similar to Emily's. "Of course, the treatment isn't cheap or covered by traditional insurance, but we've seen significant improvements in many of our patients." Jim listened, his heart pounding between hope and fear of the cost she had yet to mention. "How much are we talking?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're looking at an initial amount of $50,000 to start the treatment," Susan replied, carefully watching Jim's reaction. The amount was astronomical for a family living off the land. Jim felt his stomach churn, but looking at a photo of Emily he carried in his wallet, he knew he had no choice. "I'll get the money," he said, determined, ignoring the mountain of doubts building inside him. Susan nodded, handing him a card. "Let me know when you have the money. We'll do everything to start as soon as possible." Leaving the cafe, Jim felt torn between hopelessness and determination. At home, he looked at the farm, thinking of the generations of his family who had worked those lands. Making the toughest decision of his life, he decided to sell the farm. Mark, his son, immediately reacted with disapproval. "You're giving up everything Grandpa built to pay a gamble?" Mark confronted him, disappointment clear in his voice. "It's not a gamble. It's your mother," Jim replied, his voice filled with emotion. "And I'd do anything for her." Mark stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving Jim alone with his decision and a trembling hope that the sacrifice would be worth it. After weeks of anguish and hurried negotiations, Jim finally sealed the fate of the farm that had been in the family for generations. The buyer, an agribusiness conglomerate, had offered a sum far below the property's worth, but the urgency of Emily's situation led Jim to accept the deal without haggling. With the check in hand less robust than it should have been, Jim met with Susan to deliver the payment and commence the promised treatment. On a cloudy afternoon, with the farm sale check now converted into a substantial bank deposit, Jim met Susan at a local cafe where she received the money with a reassuring smile. "We'll start Emily's treatment immediately," she said while tucking away the envelope. "Here's the address of our lab where we'll do the first set of treatments," she continued, handing Jim a card with an address. Filled with hope, Jim headed to the address provided by Susan the next day. But upon arrival, he found a deserted building, its windows covered with newspapers and a "For Rent" sign swinging on the front door. A sense of unease washed over him as he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Growing fear of having made a terrible mistake, Jim pulled out his phone and tried calling Susan, only to be met repeatedly with her voicemail. With his mind clouded by anxiety, he made his way to the nearest police station to report the incident. There, as he explained his situation, the officer accessed the computer and soon brought even grimmer news. "Sir, the name Susan Harris appears in several fraud complaints. She's known for scamming people with false medical treatment promises." The officer's words landed like a devastating blow. The money, everything he had managed to get from the farm sale, had vanished with Susan. Jim felt himself sinking into despair. Defeated, he returned home to face Emily and Mark with the news of betrayal. Finding Emily in the garden, trying to soak in some warmth from the weak sun, Jim could barely hold himself together. "Emily, I was deceived. The treatment was a fraud. We've lost everything," he said, his voice choked with emotion and remorse. Pale, Emily squeezed Jim's hand. "We'll find a way out, Jim. We always do," she replied, trying to stay strong as their world crumbled around them. Mark, who had overheard the devastating confession, entered the conversation with a mix of anger and disappointment. "How could you be so irresponsible?" he accused, his voice laden with reproach. Jim, looking at his son and then at Emily, felt the overwhelming weight of his decisions. "I did it for her, for your mother. I just wanted to save her," he murmured, realizing that the road ahead would be harder than he ever imagined. After the revelation of the scam, the Roberts' small home became a somber place. Jim, consumed by guilt, could hardly look Emily and Mark in the eye as they tried to absorb the extent of the disaster. News of the scam spread through the community, and while some murmurs of censure circulated, there was also a palpable sense of compassion. That's when something remarkable began to happen. George, a neighbor and former rival of Jim's at the local cattle fairs, knocked on his door one crisp morning. Jim, expecting another look of disapproval, was surprised by words of solidarity. "Jim, I heard what happened. It's not a time for grudges. Emily helped my wife when she fell ill. It's time for us to pay it forward," George said, extending his hand. Motivated by George, the small-town cafe became an impromptu fundraising center. Posters were put up, and a small event was organized featuring a bake sale, a local crafts auction, and a raffle. News of the event spread, and the community's solidarity began to transform the feeling of despair. Meanwhile, Mark, who had withdrawn, consumed by anger and frustration, began to channel his energy productively. Using his research skills, he followed every lead on Susan, eventually locating crucial information that he shared with the local police. The investigation progressed, and Susan was finally arrested in a neighboring town. On the day of the event, Jim watched the community gather, offering what they could to help. People he barely knew shared stories of how Emily had touched their lives, whether through small acts of kindness or simply with her gentle smile. The sale raised more than anyone expected, and the fund for Emily's treatment began to take shape. At the end of the day, while helping to clear the tables, Jim was approached by Mark. "Dad, I know you only wanted to help Mom. I helped track down the woman who deceived you. "She won't trick anyone else," Mark said, his tone a mix of pride and sadness. Jim looked at his son, tears in his eyes, and for the first time in weeks felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, son. I couldn't have faced this without you and everyone here." The days following the fundraising event were filled with tense anticipation. With the necessary funds finally secured, Emily could begin her treatment. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the news Jim received from the doctors became increasingly positive. On a serene afternoon, Emily, now visibly stronger and healthier, sat on the porch with Jim, gazing at the vast blue sky that stretched over what used to be their farm. "Can you believe this, Jim? It feels like a miracle," she said, her voice filled with awe and gratitude. "I always believed, Em. I always knew the community would help us. They love you as much as I do," Jim replied, holding her hand. Mark joined them with a shy smile. "Mom? Dad? I have news. The community, they want to help rebuild. They said the farm isn't just a piece of land. It's a home. They want it to be our home again." Emily looked at Jim, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "That's wonderful," she whispered. Jim nodded, the weight of past struggles giving way to a new beginning. The next day, the community came with tools in hand, ready to rebuild not just the farm, but also the Roberts family's life. As they worked, laughter and conversation filled the air, bringing a sense of renewal and hope. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Jim, Emily, and Mark joined the people around an improvised bonfire. "We couldn't have done this without all of you," Jim began, his voice steady with emotion. "You've shown us the true meaning of community and family." Emily, with a radiant smile, added, "And you've given us something even more valuable than health or a home. You've given us hope."